You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. Underwear drawers are like the Wild West. You never know what you're going to pull out or what shape it's in. So upgrade your collection with the buttery soft comfort of MeUndies. MeUndies' signature fabric is as soft as a warm hug from your favorite sweater. Plus, it's breathable and oh so comfy, making it ideal for all-day wear. Get 20% off your first order, plus free shipping at MeUndies.com/Spotify with code SPOTIFY. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify, code SPOTIFY.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places. Between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Spangle Show. My name is Chris Spangle, and with me today is Caleb Franz, who is the author of The Conductor, a brand new book about John Rankin, one of the essential founding fathers of abolitionism. And he is also a host here on the We Are Libertarians podcast network, so we need you to support our own and everybody buy a book. We're going to tell you what it's about. We're going to talk a little bit about abolitionism, John Rankin, and we're also going to talk about what it takes to write a book, and then also a little bit about the Liberty Movement. So stay tuned right after this. Caleb, thanks so much for being my guest today.
Thanks for having me, Chris. It's good to be here. It's good to be back on the show, and excited to talk.
Glad that you're patient enough to do this for the third time.
Right.
So I messed up once, and then our camera died, and so now I'm using the backup camera, so that's why it looks like crap. But you look great over here on the second camera. So, but
perfect.
You know, everything's about the clips now.
Right.
We need to have good clips for you to use to promote this book, which I'm really proud of you for writing. I think it's really exciting to see somebody, conceptualize a book and come up with a thesis and not just dream it, but actually to
right.
How many pages is this bad boy?
It's about 300 pages.
Man,
about 260 footnotes.
Look at all these footnotes.
Endnotes, I should say.
Did you read this stuff? All this? How much did you have to read to write a book?
A lot. Yeah, a lot is the short answer. It's funny because people ask me, so how long did this take to write? And it was about, officially about 2.5 years from proposal to publication. Unofficially, I've been reading largely around this subject matter and this era in American history for years before then. So, you could trace it all the way back to my childhood, if I wanted to.
Yeah, because he grew up in your town, right?
Yeah, he did.
Or you grew up in his town.
Yeah, I grew up in the town that he died in.
Okay.
That he took his final breath. He lived there for about 8 years or close to 8 years. And he had visited. It's Ironton, Ohio is the town.
Okay, what part of Ohio?
It's right at the corner. So right there where the state starts to bend back up.
Okay.
It's in that bottom half.
Towards
right
Pennsylvania?
No, in Kentucky and West Virginia. It borders both states.
Okay, yeah, I drove through there. Yeah. I kind of know what you're talking about. So what's the time period, roughly?
Yeah, so he was born in 1793. Interestingly enough, he was born on the same day that the original Fugitive Slave Act passed the House in 1793 on February 4th. It was signed a few days later, or about a week later, I believe. But he kind of had this connection to slavery, unbeknownst to him, obviously at the time, but he had this connection really since the day he was born. And this obviously 1790s is much earlier than what we think of with the abolitionists and the abolition movement. Most people, I think of the 1830s and 1840s when that starts to really churn up, and that's for good reason, because most of the structure of abolitionism really did form to become this social force and the social powerhouse around that time. But Rankin laid the bedrock. He laid the foundation for that movement, which he was a part of, and he was there from the very beginning. But his works and his writings and his leadership, his moral leadership, really set the foundation for everything else to come after it.
So, not having read the whole book, I'm into the first chapter. I'm a slow reader.
Yeah.
My sense of movements like that are like, once it gets popular, let's say in the 30s and 40s, and I don't mean that by popular. I mean, there was a real social cost to being an abolitionist.
Yeah.
It just was easier, and there was an identifiable movement.
Yeah.
I'm guessing back into 1800 to 1830, it was, you were alone, and there wasn't any, like, Levi Coffin's house. It was called the Underground Railroad through the North, too, because you would get killed. Like, what was the environment like if you were a Levi Coffin or a John Rankin, and you took abolitionism seriously at that time?
Yeah, there in the first few decades, just to kind of put it into perspective, the abolition movement was kind of at its low point between like 1800 to 1830. Throughout the founding era, different plans and different schemes for trying to achieve emancipation had been tried, and some of them were successful in the North in particular, but a lot of them, especially in the South, were very unsuccessful. And once, I think a tipping point was whenever Kentucky became a state. It was the first state west of the mountains, of the Appalachian Mountains, to allow slavery into it. So that meant that slavery was joining the march westward with the rest of the United States, and it wouldn't be quarantined to the original colonies, which were now at the time states. So from there, you kind of have this, like, there a lot of people kind of go back and forth on when was the Civil War inevitable. I think there's various reasons that all have their own merits. Was it the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? Was it the nullification crisis of 1833? Was it the Missouri Compromise in 1820? And all of those things did contribute to the inevitability of the Civil War. But I think really when it started was whenever it was allowed to cross the mountains and expand westward with the country. And that kind of started this race that really, I think, could only end, maybe not exactly the way that it ended, but I think it was always going to be violence in some capacity.
You had not just the morality of it. I think to us, looking back, the morality of slavery is not debatable. Right. We have the luxury of presentism.
Yeah, it's very easy for us to be like, slavery's bad today. Right. Yeah, because we understand that. But back then it was not so clear.
Yeah, and you had the economics of the entire South tied up in it.
Yeah.
And I think if we have learned anything in recent elections, economics trump morality a lot of times.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fear to letting go of an economic system. I don't know that you could have had any other result other than violence, because it seemed to be in the South so deeply held, a system, a belief, whatever, right? And that always makes you worried, like what is going on in our present? Obviously, there's a lot of horrible stuff, and slavery is bigger now than back then by virtue of just the amount of people that we have, especially in the sex slave trade. But it doesn't feel like we think about that, right? It's just sort of like this thing that's in the back that sometimes pops up on the news. Is that sort of how it was in the North and the South for most people? Like, definitely more present and visual in the South. I've read, like, Indiana soldiers. Indiana was a very white supremacist state. Like, if you were under the notion that this Union state was somehow pro-black, it's not reality. 1852 Constitution outlawed black settlement. So, like, what was the general attitude of people at the time? Was it just sort of like this would pop up in the news and they'd think about it, similar to how we are today? Or was it really just an all-encompassing argument similar to like maybe immigration is right now?
It depended on where people lived a lot. In somewhere like Kentucky, for example, Kentucky was kind of seen as the. I'm from Kentucky for listeners who might not know, which is so.
I know that's why we feel sorry for you.
Yeah, similar to your expertise on Indiana history, I have a similar affection for Kentucky history, and it's a major subject in the book. But Kentucky was kind of seen as like if slavery has as good of a state as it can be, then it would exist in Kentucky. And that's not necessarily to say that slavery was good in Kentucky, but it was when you compare it to like Louisiana or somewhere in the deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina. Yeah, it is different, and that's undeniable. And
meaning more rights for Black Americans.
Yeah. In the Constitution in Kentucky. In the original Constitution in Kentucky, there was kind of an acknowledgement of the humanity of Black people. It still preserved slavery, but it didn't say like, oh, this is just property.
Right. It's a clause that can then adjudicate further the advancement of rights.
Right. Yes. Right. Exactly. And it's really interesting kind of back and forth because you do kind of see this intellectual crisis that's kind of happening in the minds of a lot of plantation owners in the bluegrass, because they do kind of think of themselves as more benevolent than some of their more southern counterparts in plantation owners. But they're not willing. A lot of them are not willing to go to the next logical step of saying, well, if slave is a human, if they do have humanity. Specifically, this was based around kind of like religious liberties, because a lot of the original in the first state constitution in 1792, a lot of those were either pastors or ministers or something like that. A lot of religious migration came into Kentucky, which influenced the state of slavery later on. So in somewhere like that, it was a little bit easier to kind of just say like, oh, well, it's not as bad as it could be. Obviously, it was, but there was more, I guess. There was people would understand if you were talking to the average person back then that it was a little bit easier than in some of those deeper South states. And obviously in the deeper South you go, the further away it is from the North, so they don't really have to look at it.
Yeah.
And it's easier to kind of turn a blind eye. What I try to do in this book is slavery itself is the antagonist in the book. There's not necessarily one person that's driving the antagonization of John Rankin, although he has mobs form around him. He has assassination attempts. Bounty hunters are constantly showing up on his property. All of these things that are threatening his life, his well-being, the peace of his community. They're all very present, but I try to paint slavery itself, the slave system, as the true antagonist of the book, and that's intentional because everything that slavery touched, obviously, it affected the liberties of Black Americans, but it didn't stop there.
Right.
Any time that slavery infected a system and became legal, it affected the civil liberties of white men as well, abolitionists like John Rankin. And I don't say that obviously to diminish any of the impacts that slavery had on Black Americans, but I think it is important that slavery itself is a corrosive system that eats away at everyone's liberties.
Right.
And today, I think...
And the morality.
And the morality, yes. And that is very much a subject that Rankin focuses on quite a bit. But you see civil liberties attacked in southern slaveholding states because the institution itself required basically universal support for it.
Yeah.
And if you were a slave owner and you wanted to emancipate your slaves, then that was a threat itself to the slaveholding system. So there had to be either severe restrictions or outright prohibitions against those kind of things. So even if a slaveholder kind of had like this come to Jesus moment, the system of slavery severely restricted anyone's ability to make good on what they knew to be the right thing to do.
Are there some examples that you found of that? I've never really thought about that before.
Yeah, in Virginia, this was very popular. Actually, in Kentucky, that was one thing that they did not expressly do, was prohibit the manumissions of slaves, and that was kind of one way in which Kentucky kind of thought itself as a little bit more
progressive,
a little bit more enlightened than some of the more deep South or that Tidewater region. In Virginia, this was a big point of contention, and especially throughout the founding era, where you have, I think, a lot of people where it does kind of confuse us about kind of the nature of like, well, all these founders are kind of talking about liberty, but they are themselves slave owners. Now, it's not to say that this is the only reason why, some of them kept slaves. Obviously it was a compromise, and there was a debate over it. So in order for there to be a compromise, there has to be another side. Mm-hmm. And that other side was very prevalent, especially in Georgia and South Carolina and places like that. But there is this other externality that the slave system built kind of a fail-safe upon a fail-safe upon a fail-safe to ensure that its own survivability would last. And that is something that Rankin is constantly running up against throughout his entire life.
Yeah, this is what always confuses me about, I guess I'm not totally confused, but some in the modern right with like the 1776 project to counter the 1619 project, and let's not have slavery talked about in schools, because if you are a libertarian leaning person, you would want this to be talked about, I think, because you have the state controlling every aspect of people's lives. I mean,
yes.
just like using that example of living in the South, what sense of privacy would there be in a society that will stop at nothing to hunt somebody down?
Right. Yeah.
If you are whispered about and suspected to be blah, 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 it's like the reality of how a lot of right-wingers on Twitter talk about the COVID era, right?
Yeah.
Like, yes, it was really bad that people were calling their neighbors into hotlines for leaving their house, but like, this has happened in America before, but in much more serious consequences in an institution. And how did we find liberty through that? How did we regain a moral conscience? And what did that cost to get out of that system? And how are we still messing up, right? In certain ways. And I think when you are so intimately close to a subject like this and you hear stuff about, should we talk about slavery? And as a libertarian, like, what do you think about that? Like, let's put it, I mean, my view is like, put it all out on the table. Let's hear history, knowing that a lot of our history was written in the 1910s and 20s. That's like, if you go to St. Augustine, Florida, it's all BS.
Yeah.
Like Irving Washington went to Spain in the late 1800s and fabricated the history of the Fountain of Youth.
Yeah.
Like, that's just not real, or all kinds of things were invented by marketing agencies in the 20s that have become accepted as history, like the cherry tree.
Yeah.
Right? So I feel like getting this right and telling the actual story of the experience of slavery has a lot of lessons for choices we make today and how we deal with public morality.
Yeah, that is obviously that was kind of in the back of my mind throughout the writing process. And I started writing this around the same time. Well, not around the same time. It was shortly after a lot of the riots in 2020 took place.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of discussions about people who should be left up and, statues that should be left up or like renaming certain things. So all this discussion is very much, front and center in my mind. And I think a lot of it comes down to us talking past each other. I don't think that most people who are opposed to the 1619 Project, for instance, which I also don't think it's just bad history, but most people who are opposed to that, I don't think they're opposed to that because they're opposed to slavery being taught in school. They're opposed to this kind of like worldview of the oppressed versus the oppressor, and if there's either you're black or you're white, and if you're in one camp, then you can't possibly be in the other camp. And I think that kind of course, there's a rubber band effect to this, right?
Sure.
Where it goes incredibly far in the other direction. But Rankin is one example of someone, and he's obviously not the only one, but he's one that I have found incredibly personable and incredibly not exceptional, but accessible for most people to approach, to show kind of the bridge between the founding era and what we eventually get in the 13th Amendment. And the history of the Underground Railroad and the history of abolitionism was a history of community and cooperation between black people who were escaping to try to find their own freedom and white people who understood the moral sin that this was. And a lot of this started in churches and in the pulpit.
In both directions? Abolition started in the churches, or? Yeah.
Abolition. Well, the abolitionism that we understand it in the course that it took did start in the churches. Yeah, because obviously there were some Enlightenment ideas that were kind of focused around that in the founding era, but a lot of those ideas just wasn't doing enough to persuade people morally about the ills of slavery.
Right.
And that's where preachers like John Rankin came in, where it took a moral awakening of the people, which he was a byproduct of the Second Great Awakening, and a lot of those happenings in the West. What was then in the West? Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana and all those states.
Not the fake West, like Utah.
Right, yeah.
Well, I think this is like an important point to make, because if your algorithm is set to the left side of culture, then Christianity's horrible. It's oppressed the world. Women are wearing Handmaid's Tale dresses, and supported slavery, and Southern preachers would justify slavery through distorting parts of the Old Testament and New.
And that happened. That definitely happened. It was a point that Rankin specifically took offense to, because he understood Scripture to be, he referred it to be one grand scheme of benevolence. So he obviously was very learned in the subject, and that was his letters on American slavery that he wrote to his brother Thomas after he had purchased slaves. That was a major point of those letters, because so many people in the South, so many preachers in the South, would justify their slaveholding through Scripture. And he saw that as a complete fabrication of what Scripture actually says.
Yeah.
And obviously today, you talk to anyone, no one's going to
Methodist,
deny
a Methodist preacher and a Christian nationalist preacher don't have a lot in common now. Right?
Yeah, well, yeah, but no one's going to deny that, like, a charismatic preacher, or some kind of preacher somewhere is going to twist scripture for their own benefit.
Right.
I think everyone kind of knows that people do that, and that it is, if you're a Christian, then you understand that to be a sinful act. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the way that Rankin viewed this as well, is that not only are you painting scripture in a way that is not accurate, you're preventing a lot of people who are under your watch, that you're enslaving, from being able to receive the gospel. And that to Rankin was not just a crisis of the state of the nation with slavery. It was also a moral crisis with regard to their souls. If they're enslaving them in their life here on earth, and they're preventing them from eternal life in heaven, then that's a special kind of evil. Is kind of what he looked at it.
Yeah. I mean, it's right on. So where did the moral conscience develop? Like, did he just come out of the womb? My vision of an abolitionist is Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, fire-breathing dragons, basically.
Yeah.
Did guys who probably were 15 and just like, this is fighting with everybody, right? Was he always kind of this way, where he was like just super morally clear about things? Or was there a point that kind of led him to develop the conscience? And then the question after that is like, we'll ask when he took action. But I think it's important for the development of becoming an abolitionist and devoting himself to this. Like, how did that happen?
Yeah. He grew up in eastern Tennessee, in what was Dandridge, what still is Dandridge, Tennessee, in that region in Jefferson County. His mother was a very opinionated woman, and was always very against slavery. He kind of grew up in an anti-slavery household, and that rubbed off on him. He can't. I haven't been able to find any instance in which he maybe was in like morally murky waters on the issue of slavery, where he had questions about it. He seems to have always been opposed to slavery from his youth. And this came to blows whenever he started preaching in eastern Tennessee, in his church, and there were obviously slaveholders in his church.
So he was preaching abolition in Tennessee.
It wasn't necessarily abolition, but he did deliver a sermon against what he referred to as all forms of oppression. And obviously people could kind of read between the lines, and people knew Rankin. So it ruffled some feathers.
Started with being suspected.
Yeah.
And then from there, once you're suspected, it's like, why not just go all in, right?
Yeah, exactly. So he didn't outright like deliver a sermon against slavery in Tennessee, but he did preach against oppression, and that was enough for the elders to kind of sit him down and say, look, you can't talk about that. This was right off right off of Gabriel's rebellion in the early 1800s, and as well as the Haitian revolt, slave revolt in late 1700s. And the idea of slave revolts were very top of mind for a lot of people in the South. So there was legitimate fear in a lot of people in the South that if you're talking about emancipation, there's going to be bloodshed on our doorsteps. So they told him that he can't preach about that, and he made a decision that he felt called to wage this battle against slavery. And if he couldn't do it there, then he had to move north, had to move somewhere where it was free soil. So he picked up and he kind of started his journey up north to Ohio.
Did he face any kind of qualms about removing himself from the situation? Like, I don't know the time period enough to know if this is an ignorant question, but I would think that if you're in the South preaching a form of abolitionism, and you're a little closer to the source than if you move to Ohio, which is a free state, and it's a little harder to influence, the culture, right?
Yeah. So in Eastern Tennessee, there were like pockets of like anti-slavery pockets in the area that he grew up in. And he was even active. He was part of the Tennessee Manumissions Society. I believe this was 1816. So even before he left, Tennessee, he was already getting involved in anti-slavery activity, which was another reason why, the elders kind of like set him down and said, look, you can't talk about this. A lot of most slaveholders most abolitionists who lived in the South eventually moved to the North because there was that risk, because they very easily could have been killed.
Yeah.
Or chased out of town or something. This happened with James Birney, the Liberty Party, the first presidential candidate for the Liberty Party. He was in Kentucky and he tried to start a paper that was an abolitionist paper, and it did not go over well. So he had to move to Cincinnati. I do think it is quite telling that Rankin only went as far as he needed to. So he only went as far as Ripley, Ohio. He could have continued, to go north. Ripley was like that region was kind of his original plan, but later on in life, he could have left. He could have gone to the Western Reserve. He could have gone up to New England, where Garrison and so many of the other abolitionists were.
Yeah.
And he didn't. He stayed in Ripley because he knew that was where the fight was. And
right on the Ohio River.
Right on the Ohio River. His house he built. It's the only house, and it's still there. It's pretty much more or less exactly the way it was that you would have seen it back then. Where his house is the only house on the hill right behind Ripley, and he built it this way so that way anyone escaping slavery would be able to identify the house by putting a light in the window or on a pole outside.
Which is where the lawn jockey comes from, right? And the candle in the window, and like these are symbols of this is a safe place to come seek shelter. Right,
exactly, yeah. So people from miles away would be able to see the house and identify it, and see the light in the window, knowing that like it's safe.
So he chose a high spot on the hill.
So he chose the high spot in the hill so he could be visible. Now the flip side to that is that as anyone escaping slavery would be able to see this, so too would their pursuers.
Yeah,
and that's where the risk came in, and that's where the danger came in. You really see this really start to bubble up after he starts to be a lot more vocal outwardly, and people start to know the name of John Rankin when he gets involved in the American Anti-Slavery Society and the Ohio Anti-Slavery Society. There are, like I mentioned, bounties that are put on his head. $3,000, up to $3,000 in that time, which is about $100,000 today. So
that's remarkable.
It is. And everyone knew him to be the leader. So they knew that, you take Rankin out, dead or alive, then the rest of the system will start to deteriorate, and it'll become much easier to expose the entire.
It literally sounds like Sinwar and Hamas, like our theory of how we take out Al Qaeda. We get Bin Laden, and then it'll crumble. Right. It sounds like he was an insurgent leader in a system that had won.
Yeah, and was very threatened by his existence because he was right there. Because they didn't have to run all the way like inward into Ohio before they found a safe house. It was right across the river, and as soon as you cross the river, he had never lost a passenger, is what he said. So there were over 2,000 people who came through his house. One of the most active, if not the most active, sites in the entire history of the Underground Railroad. And he never once lost a passenger. Everyone knew that once they got to his house, they would never catch them again. So there was immense pressure on the slave hunters to make sure to intercept them before they got to Ripley. Right. Because if they got to Ripley, the chances would dwindle to near zero.
So my conception of the Underground Railroad is very 1990s cartoon explanations, right? Like, I'm sure I was taught it better than I remember it.
Sure.
But it's Harriet Tubman, brave slaves leave their plantation, enslaved people, leave their plantation, walk through the woods for a long time, run from some dogs, get to the river, and then, they're free, or they sneak up to Canada. Now that I'm an adult and I read history, I understand it was a lot more complex and a lot more dangerous. First, what's the scope of it? Like you said, 2,000. I'm surprised that's a small number. Like, do we have any idea of how many people were enslaved and how many people actually left through the Underground Railroad? And then, like, what did the average experience of someone on the Underground Railroad look like through the lens of John Rankin?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of times first of all, they never kept anyone who stopped at their station for longer than a few hours at most. They had to keep it going. They had to keep running.
Is there a lot of arms? Are they very armed to the teeth? Like, if you get to Rankin's house, it's just a lot of guns?
Oh, yeah. There are quite a few instances. There's two instances in particular in the story where, I guess you could say three. There's a lot, but there's three that come up into mind. One where he is gone and his wife, there are bounty hunters that come up, like searching for someone who had escaped, and they're very confident that they came to Rankin's house. And she points a shotgun in their face with the baby in her hand and said, "You can't come into this house." And eventually, this was a big standoff until eventually cooler heads prevailed. There was a siege on his house where they actually tried to kill him and his family. Nobody in his family was hurt. No one was killed or anything like that. The only people who did get shot were the people who were, the assassins.
Killed?
I shot for sure. Yeah. I don't
unfortunate.
I don't think they were killed. I have to go back and look. I do know.
You should read that book. It's
shot.
Good.
Yeah. I've heard that. Yeah. And then there was a very dramatic moment where this was after the siege happened, a few years after. And I think that this was really when the siege took place on his house, he kind of started to see the inevitability of the Civil War, where he understood that violence was the only thing that slaveholders understand. And if you don't fight fire with fire. Now, he fought to find a peaceful resolution to the end of slavery up until basically the days leading up to the Civil War. But his hope for that to actually be the outcome, it started to dwindle a bit. And later on in that decade, when he saw there were a handful of people that missed the rendezvous point, and the sun was rising in the morning. He came out. Obviously, he could see everywhere on the other side of the river, and they were just sitting there, just helplessly. And he was prepared to. He called an emergency meeting with all the conductors. He was prepared to go over, cross the river, walk them into Ripley in broad daylight. And he instructed everyone to bring all of your firearms, like all of them.
Wow.
And he was prepared to essentially invade Kentucky, bring them into Ripley and wait until nightfall to shoot them back up through the line. Now, this was a very reckless plan. And it did not, that's not what ended up happening, because everyone kind of talked him out of it and was like, John, if you do this, everyone's going to see. Like, they're going to know that you're harboring these people.
Right.
And then, you might have a war on your hands. And this happened, the kind of threat of war there in Ripley was present basically throughout the entirety of his life. And eventually he went to church, he prayed about it, and he had kind of a calming overcome him, and he realized like it was going to be okay. So he waited until nightfall. They went over and got him, got the three that were over there, and then they shot them up the line. But he was the threat of violence was constant, and it was not just that they were constantly being threatened. They were not only able but very willing to defend themselves, their communities, and anyone who came through their station.
Like, when you hear talk of Civil War now, does it compare? Like, there's always these, we're heading.
You mean like modern
like
day?
Tim Pool,
like,
Tim Pool's
it's going to be a civil war.
We're going to a civil war, or we're Rome, or like,
yeah,
the Grackeye brothers. You see a lot of parallels with Trump and the shaving of norms and the ditching of constitutionalism. So there's alarm bells that go off for me, but like, I could see how through this time period leading up to the Civil War there are parallels now, but like, do you get concerned, having really studied this time period, about our time period? Like, are there things where it's just so? I heard you say they love war, they love violence, slaveholders were evil people, and they were willing to do that by any means. I don't get that sense from Twitter left, Twitter right. You know what I mean? Like, in regular life, a person who is not very online is usually a good person you can talk to, right? It's just sort of like this online thing that doesn't reflect reality in so many cases. And so I think we're going to be okay, but do you see parallels through this story that give you concern about our own time?
I don't think that we are as close to civil war as a lot of people fear, because the Civil War that actually happened, it was over a very specific, very violent, and very embedded institution in the United States that does not exist anymore. It was not just a disagreement among people for political differences. This was like the institution of slavery itself had such an influence over the country that it just obviously does not have anymore.
Slaveholder propaganda in the North was very prevalent and widespread. And attitudes here in Indiana were, it's good for them, right? Which persisted
right. Yeah, there were arguments like
the
that.
late 20th century.
And I don't see anything like that today that is threatening. It's either threatening or pushing the country into that direction. With that said, though, obviously, tensions are high right now, and I do think that we may be closer than what we should be. But there were, I think it's really important to understand how many times that we kind of thought that we were about to break into a civil war, and it was really just like, no, we weren't close then. But it was kind of a push in that direction. So are we closer to 1820 after the Missouri Compromise, and it was just a step in that direction, even though if it went in a different direction in 1820, would Civil War break out? Probably not. Who's to say? I mean, you're talking about hypotheticals at that point, but I don't think that we're there yet. But I do think that there are problems in this country that do kind of mirror some of the things that we were going through then that should be addressed. But I do think that we can also get through those problems because we went through a civil war. Well, and got through on the other side.
Yeah, I think to me what I heard you say is the level of physical insecurity that people were experiencing is kind of what drove the country crazy. Mm-hmm. That is like the thing for me in America, that if we get to the point where people feel physically threatened by being a Republican or a Democrat,
yeah,
that you can't speak about that. And I think you saw that reaction, that Trump is a reaction to don't talk about these things, just trust the science.
Yeah.
You know, and I think there's obviously legitimate left-leaning complaints about Donald Trump, right? And there's also its own cancel culture on the right. Like, as a liberal in the right wing, the classical liberal who is not MAGA and not a MAGA libertarian, right? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't believe my DMs.
Oh yeah.
You know, the pressure to conform to left or right is very intense if you are an independent person. Mm-hmm. I don't feel physically threatened, though. People just go, you're an idiot, right? And I feel like that, to me, is...
Yeah, I think social media kind of flares up.
Yeah. It makes you feel bad, but it's not like... I don't feel like my family's in danger. I just put up a cute picture of my son with his Donald Trump hair. Like, I don't fear for his safety because I do a political podcast and people aren't coming to knock on my door. And I feel like if we get to that point where people's physical safety feels so threatened, I think in terms of gun ownership and gun control with schools shootings, I think we're getting to a point where you're going to start seeing a tipping point away from a libertarian position on gun control. Because, I mean, when we're walking with my kindergarten daughter several months ago and talking about a school shooting, and she goes, "Oh, is that why they made us hide in the closet today?" Because this is when all the text messages were going around a couple months ago, 3 months ago. And as somebody who is a staunch defender of the Second Amendment and very few limits on gun ownership, it makes you pause and go, man, I don't want my kid living in that kind of world.
Right.
Like, it makes you softer towards, now the reality of like gun confiscation, that would be like Civil War level violence. Like how many police officers and military men are you willing to send to the homes of gun owners and have them die?
Many of them gun owners
themselves.
Yeah.
Like gun confiscation would never work. Right. But I mean, if I didn't have like the libertarian philosophy that I've been steeping in for 17 years, like I know I came into the libertarian movement very soft on gun control and was convinced by gun owners of my ignorance. And I feel like that's one area where parents and people in society are starting to, that lack of personal safety. I think some of the immigrant stuff, like Laken Riley's killer got convicted today, as we're recording this, and that's where Trump, you're not personally safe in the suburbs. You can't even be safe in the suburbs anymore because an immigrant's lurking around the corner. I totally reject that, but it really was a motivating factor. So to me, like what you just said, is the defining thing is personal safety. Mm-hmm. It's because if you're just a resident of Ripley, Ohio, like, how are your property values when you live next to John Rankin and there's like shootouts at the old K Corral, like next door, like, oh, they're at it again. Like, we've got these neighbors down the street. There's always an ambulance or a police car called. And you're like, John Rankin's up to it again.
Yeah. I also think that in Ripley in particular, there was a level of community that was paramount to his success. As well. And I think that the network of community, obviously there were communities that conductors were far less welcome in, where, they may not necessarily be pro-slavery, but they don't understand someone helping someone that they've never met before, because you're bringing a war to their town, and you're threatening the safety of their children in this kind of environment. But I don't think that there's anything today now that is that issue that is pushing the country into the possibility of civil war.
It's just so egregious morally. It's reprehensible. Right. It's so ugly we can't comprehend it. Like, I think abortion is the only thing that even comes close, but it's still not even close.
Yeah, and again, the level of just how institutionalized it was. Yeah. Not only the moral issue, but the institutional issue as well. Of slavery was the dominating force of everything, every decision in the South, one way or another. Now, that's not to say that everyone who ever decided something that may be more, liberty inclined. That's not to say that there aren't like liberty answers to those issues, but for these people, you look at things like states' rights or nullification or property rights or things that classical liberals appreciate to at least some degree. These were all just crutches for slaveholders.
Right.
It was very convenient to look at these issues and say, well, I have a right to own slaves because of X, Y, and Z. Because we have a right to determine our own future in South Carolina, or we have a right to, do this or that. I have a right to my property or something like that. But all that goes out the window whenever slavery starts expanding in the West. And then all of a sudden, all these other states are wanting to decide their own future. And then all of a sudden the balance of power in Congress is upset. And then it's far less states' rights, or fugitive slave laws get passed. And then all of a sudden, states can't nullify, or at least in their minds, states can't nullify something like that because that's for us.
Yeah, to contextualize it, it's like Republicans don't want to add Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico as states, because then all of a sudden that's adding 2 blue states.
Yeah.
Right? When we're at 50-50, you don't want to add those electoral votes to the count. What was the first moment where Rankin took an action? Because beliefs can be one thing, and speaking out certainly is an action, but deciding to bring people into your home and invite war into your home for a moral cause you believe in, what was that first act for him?
So he moved to Kentucky for about 4 years before going on into Ripley after he left Tennessee. And it was not his intention to stay. He had his sights set on Ohio because it was free soil, but he made a few stops along the way, and there were a few, let's just say, happenstances that led to him eventually staying in the town of Carlisle, Kentucky, at first for 6 months to get through the winter. His wife was very pregnant at the time, and his horse kind of collapsed after the exhaustion of the journey. So,
not the one carrying the pregnant wife, was it?
Yeah.
Oh boy. Ah, man, you've got a pregnant wife and I've got a pregnant wife. Let me tell you, that must have been a bad self-esteem day.
And he was going around trying to preach to various churches, and one of the pastors in Paris, Kentucky, said that there's a vacancy in Carlisle. He really liked Rankin, and he said, I think you'd be a good fit.
Yeah.
Well, this community at the Concord Church in Carlisle, Kentucky, a lot of them were very instrumental in the foundation of the Kentucky Abolition Society about a decade earlier. And in Tennessee, he did not have that level of community that he would eventually experience in Ripley. And in Kentucky, whenever he was experiencing this, this was kind of the first community that he could really feel himself in.
So he had these beliefs, but then once he met community that believed like him, then it became action.
It started to, and then a few years later, he became very concerned over the state of the souls of those who were in slavery throughout the bluegrass, and as I mentioned before, and he started a Sunday school for them. And he went around to slaveholders, getting their express permission to be able to preach to them. He told them, like, I won't teach them how to read or write. It's just the message. And that's it. But the threat of, well, if they hear the message of freedom through Christ, then they, might start to, the gears might start to turn.
Where else should I be
what
free?
about freedom, like physically?
I don't want them developing a moral conscience. They might.
So you see these like, the angel and the devil on your shoulder.
I'm guessing they didn't need religion to know everything was already wrong, and I want to be free. Like it's inherent in natural rights.
Right. So they there were mobs that started to form around his Sunday school classes, and eventually it didn't stop him from teaching, but it did stop people from attending.
Okay.
And it kind of scared them off. So that was whenever he realized he got his first exposure to the mobocracy, and that was very prevalent around that time. And he realized like he needed to complete his journey to Ohio and really start his activity there. And a lot of other people in the church also kind of felt the same way. They started moving up to Indiana, Ohio, and various places like that.
So what did he do during the Civil War and beyond? I mean, after emancipation, did he feel a sense of accomplishment, or was...
Yes. Yeah, okay. Definitely. So throughout the Civil War, this was actually a question that I had that there wasn't a whole lot of information that had been recorded previously in some of the other works that had been written about Rankin. So I was very curious about this because this is the object that he had worked for his entire life, and very little had been written about it. So that naturally kind of sparked a curiosity in me. There were things. Obviously, he was much older at this time, born in 1793, so he's in his 60s, 70s, around that, I believe 70s, around that time frame, and he's limited on how much he can do physically. But he did continue to write, and he wrote several op-eds and several editorials that he put into the local paper. There was one that I was able to find.
Was one of them, haha, I win?
I mean, he wouldn't do that.
After Lincoln, he just must have been like, yeah, I told you so.
Yeah, no, he wouldn't do something like that, but he
did, humility. Okay.
Yeah.
Forgot about that.
He did want to, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, which this was one of the editorials that I was able to find, which I was really happy about. He wrote an editorial in the Ripley Bee talking about how he's sharing in the celebration with all the abolitionists that were ecstatic at the time, but also where he lived, Kentucky wasn't affected by the Emancipation Proclamation because it was loyal to the Union. So he still had work to do. He was still working on the Underground Railroad, helping people escape into freedom. So he kind of writes about how this is great and we should rejoice in this accomplishment, but it's not over and we still have work to do. And kind of a similar response after the 13th Amendment, where yes, we have won and this is great, but people who are coming out of slavery, they're not free really. They aren't equal citizens. There's still things like universal suffrage and things like that to work on.
Yeah.
And there's this this part, this big editorial that he writes after the Civil War in 1865, December 28th, I believe. So it was just days after Christmas. I like to imagine that that's how he spent his Christmas, was writing this piece, because it is quite large. But he's writing about how, if America wants to be able to proceed into the next century and so on and so forth, we must become a nation of righteousness. And he points to, universal suffrage and various things like that. Now, this was also a point where he's very old and he's very tired, and he finally accomplished the thing that he had done, or that he had wanted to accomplish throughout all of his life.
Yeah.
This was his calling throughout his life. So he's not terribly active in like 14th, 15th Amendment kind of stuff. And he mostly just goes back to the thing that he always wanted to do, which was being a small town preacher and going around, and he starts to revive dying churches in the area and kind of breathes new life into them. And you can kind of see a relief in him and the way that he approaches life after the Civil War. And there's a sense of satisfaction after that. He goes to Washington, D.C. He goes to the White House and calls upon Ulysses S. Grant, because Grant was one of his students before Grant went to West Point. And he talks about how, you can just kind of see how proud he was that like one of his students not only is president of the United States, but also saved the Union.
Yeah.
So that was a big point of satisfaction for him as well.
I saw my journalism high school teacher today, and she felt the same way. So
it's
just couldn't be prouder.
Ulysses S. Grant, Chris
podcaster.
Spangle. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what is the main lesson for you that listeners can take away from John Rankin's life that they're going to get out of the book? Like how can they apply the lessons of John Rankin to their life?
There are a lot of lessons depending on who you are and what you're doing, but I think the big lesson is Rankin's life is a case study of moral leadership, and he really understands quite perfectly how to approach issues tactfully and with taste, without really losing sight of the bigger picture. So he was a very practical guy, but he always held on to that sense of, immediate emancipation is what I'm working towards. So I'm not gonna compromise on anything that might compromise that. But there's a lot of different ways that we could possibly get to immediate emancipation. One is through a civil war, and that wasn't a direction that he wanted to go, because he thought that was the worst case scenario. And it's a risk in and of itself. Even if a civil war breaks out, it's not necessarily going to go your way.
Yeah.
So he was very committed to peace as well. And I think that level of understanding the moral gravity of a situation while also understanding the nuances of a situation. I mean, he was a Southerner. He understood the concerns that people in the South had over these issues. And he was able to talk to them that didn't feel like a New Englander was coming out of town and kind of talking down to them.
Yeah.
He could speak to them in a way that they felt like he knew why they were so hesitant.
Yeah.
And in a way that made them actually reconsider.
Yeah, I think contextualization is hugely important. Like in the Christian community, Tim Keller is kind of the guy that everybody looks at in terms of an evangelical model for the 21st century, which is standing up at a pulpit and preaching repentance like Billy Graham did isn't how it works now. Back then, you had the presumption of goodness in Christianity. Yeah. And now you have to convince people that Christianity is good before you can even get to like where we were in the 2000s of like, let's just read Lee Strobel, and if it's correct and we have enough facts, then we'll like, now people don't question whether God exists. They question, is this system even worth adopting? Is it good? Yeah. Right. And the contextualization piece that is so talked about in like evangelical missions now, it's like, if you don't have a relationship with somebody, don't preach to them. They're not going to take you seriously unless they see your walk, they see your life. And I think there's a lesson in communication there, like trying to understand the people that you're talking to, if you want to persuade them, is incredibly important. And coming from their culture, understanding their sensitivities, understanding their motivations, and treating them like people, even if they're doing the wrong thing. A lot of times people do the wrong thing because they've never heard or seen or tasted or touched anything different, right? That's just their reality. And then somebody comes along and goes, you can do it a different way. Yeah. Here's how. And I think that's that example of like people from New England coming down to the South to tut-tut them. I think in our society now, we've got a lot of tut-tutting from a bunch of different directions, and people, instead of like listening and taking that in, they just raise their hackles.
Yep.
It's like, who are you to tell me what to do? I don't,
Yeah, and Rankin's life also, I think, provides a masterclass in practicing truth and grace. And what I mean by that is he never once, no matter who they were, no matter if they were, the most vile slaveholder versus, just someone in his family, he always extended grace to the person. And he was always willing to say, I am going to treat you like a man. And that is all I'm asking for you in return, is to do the same to those that you come across. And the most powerful example, I think, is whenever he tells this to his brother at the end of his letters and says, I hope, I'm paraphrasing, but like, I hope and I pray that you take heed to these letters. But even if you don't, I am your brother and I will not speak your doom. And that's how he closes letters. That was the final few words in all of his letters on American slavery, is an extension of grace. And I think that is quite powerful in the way that we can approach these today. Because today, you have people who are questioning if they can even eat Thanksgiving dinner with their families anymore because of the way they
Joe and Mika. I mean, Joe and Mika from MSNBC go see Trump, and it's the most offensive, awful, mocked thing going on this week. And you're like, if you have a problem with two sides sitting down and trying to figure out where they can reconnect, you are the problem.
Yeah.
It is not Joe and Mika and Trump. It is good on Trump to extend the grace. It's good on Joe and Mika to have the humility to go and meet with somebody they called Hitler like 3 weeks ago, right? Like, to me, that's exactly what America needs more of, which is some humility, some grace, some understanding. And no, they're not going to be and then 3 weeks from now, they could be calling each other Hitler again.
Yeah.
But at least an effort is made. And I just think so many times we want to just dig in, cast that person aside, and like, that's just not what we're called to do. Like, that's not what builds a healthy, functioning society.
Yeah, and I think if Rankin can extend that kind of grace to his,
literal slaveholders,
to his own brother who became a slaveholder, and he felt like this was the ultimate betrayal of his family, and he still said, "I am your brother. I'm not going to speak your doom."
Yeah.
Like, if he can do that to someone like that, and spoiler alert, he did emancipate his slaves.
Yeah.
At the end of these letters. So not only is it something that we should do, it does actually work too. And I think that we're all better off for it if we try to practice the kind of grace that Rankin did.
All right, I wish we could continue on, but that's a great place to leave it. It's a powerful story. Tell us where we can buy the book.
Yeah, you can. It's basically anywhere where you get your books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anything like that. So just please, all I ask is really that you read it and you share the story. And of course, it'd be great if you reviewed the book as well. So if you want to give me a 5-star, that would be very much appreciated. But outside of that, just please go out and get the book and tell more people about the story of Reverend Rankin.
All right. Thank you, Caleb. CalebFranz.com. Franz. Yep. You can say it either way, but I'm from we have an Appalachian root, so it's Franz. We don't know how to say it. We say it different every time.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
That was very Trump-like of me. I did the weave there from Franz. Nobody cares what his name is. Read the book. All right. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Chris Spangle Show.